Wyoming Territory, 1882. As the morning sun chased shadows across the eastern ridge, Ethan Norwood stood on his newly built porch, squinting at the distant horizon. 24 years old with dreams as vast as the prairie before him, he'd finally done what many said couldn't be accomplished, carved a respectable ranch from the untamed wilderness of the Medicine Bow foothills. 3 years of back-breaking labor had transformed a humble homestead claim into Whispering Pines Ranch, and today would bring the final piece of his carefully constructed future, a wife. The train wasn't due until noon, giving Ethan time to fret over details. He ran a hand through his thick chestnut hair, wondering if the house was presentable enough. It wasn't grand. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a proper cook stove, and a sitting room adorned with simple furniture he'd mostly built himself. But it was solid. Built to last, like the life he intended to create. "You'll wear a trench in that porch before she even arrives," called his neighbor, old Samuel Wilson, riding up on a dappled mare. "Nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, I see." Ethan laughed, though the sound carried his anxiety. "Just want everything perfect, Sam. A lady coming all the way from Boston deserves that much. Still can't believe you're pinning your hopes on some mail-order bride. Pretty fella like you could have had your pick of any girl in Laramie." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Town girls want town lives. I need a partner who understands what building something means." He looked across his land, the neat barn, the growing herd of cattle, the fields waiting for spring planting. "Besides, Miss Dorothy James and I have exchanged letters for 6 months. She's educated, practical, and willing to take a chance. That's the kind of courage I admire." Samuel shook his head. "Well, I hope she's as pretty as her penmanship, for your sake." He tipped his hat. "I'll leave you to your pacing. Lucy's invited you both for Sunday dinner. After you've had time to get acquainted, of course." As Samuel rode away, Ethan's mind drifted to the stack of letters tied with string in his bedside drawer. Dorothy's elegant script had revealed a sharp mind and gentle heart. She'd written of her life teaching at a ladies' seminary in Boston, her love of literature, her longing for open spaces after years in crowded cities. What she hadn't explained was why an accomplished, educated woman would abandon civilization for the untamed territories, a question that occasionally troubled Ethan's thoughts. Too soon, it seemed, the grandfather clock in the sitting room chimed 11. Ethan quickly changed into his best shirt, brushed down his tan trousers, and hitched the wagon for town. His reflection in the water barrel showed a handsome face, strong jaw lightly stubbled after this morning's careful shave, clear blue eyes that crinkled at the corners from squinting in the sun, and a straight nose that had somehow escaped being broken despite his fair share of youthful scuffles. The 12-mile journey to Laramie gave Ethan plenty of time to rehearse his greeting, though each version sounded more awkward than the last. As the train station came into view, belching smoke already visible beyond the town's modest skyline, his mouth went dry. What if she took one look at the reality of frontier life and demanded passage back east? Ethan wasn't the only one waiting on the platform. Several families gathered to meet arriving relatives. A couple of ranch hands loitered by the freight office, and the station master checked his pocket watch with practiced importance. The train's whistle pierced the air, and Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. The locomotive thundered into the station, brakes squealing as it slowed. Doors opened, and passengers began to disembark. First businessmen in dark suits, then a family with 3 small children, followed by 2 elderly ladies. Ethan scanned each face, searching for the woman who matched Dorothy's descriptions. Then he saw her, a slim figure in a practical navy traveling dress, honey blonde hair tucked beneath a modest hat. She stood on the platform looking uncertain, one gloved hand clutching a small valise, the other holding a letter that Ethan recognized as his own. He approached slowly, removing his hat. "Miss James? I'm Ethan Norwood." Her eyes, a startling shade of green, widened as she took him in. "Mr. Norwood," she said, her voice softer than he'd imagined, with the refined accent of the East. "How do you do?" "Very well, now that you've arrived safely." Ethan extended his hand, then awkwardly withdrew it, unsure of the proper etiquette. "May I take your luggage?" "This is all I have with me," she replied, indicating the valise. The rest was to follow on the next freight train. Ethan frowned. "That's all. But I believe in traveling light, she interrupted with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As Ethan led her to the wagon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Dorothy walked with elegant posture but seemed to favor her left side slightly, and despite the cool spring air, a faint sheen of perspiration dotted her brow. "Are you feeling well, Miss James? The journey must have been exhausting." "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," she said quickly. "Just eager to see this dream ranch you've described so eloquently in your letters." Ethan helped her onto the wagon seat, noticing her slight wince as she settled beside him. The woman beside him was undeniably beautiful, delicate features, a straight nose, full lips currently pressed together in what might be pain or merely concentration. But something about her seemed fragile in a way her letters had not suggested. As they pulled away from town, Dorothy removed her gloves and Ethan noticed her hands, soft and uncalloused, as expected of a teacher, but with a faint tremble. "I hope you won't be disappointed," he said. "Whispering Pines isn't grand by Eastern standards." "I didn't come west expecting luxury, Mr. Norwood." "Ethan, please. We're to be married, after all." At this, Dorothy's face paled slightly. "Yes, of course. Ethan." She turned to look at the landscape, vast and rolling beneath the wide Wyoming sky. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined. Wait until you see the ranch. It sits in a valley with a creek running through it and pines on the northern ridge. In the evening, when the wind blows just right, they make a sound like whispers." Ethan found himself talking faster than usual, filling the silence between them. "I've planted apple trees that should bear fruit next year, and there's good grazing for the cattle. The house isn't fancy, but it's warm in winter and cool in summer." Dorothy listened attentively, asking questions about the land and livestock that revealed her intelligence, if not her experience with ranch life. Yet something in her demeanor remained guarded, as though she were holding herself at a careful distance. As they crested the final hill before the ranch, Ethan stopped the wagon. Below them stretched Whispering Pines, nestled in its sheltered valley, the white-painted house with its wide porch, the red barn, the corral where his best quarter horses grazed, and beyond, the scattered dark shapes of cattle against green pasture. "There it is," he said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Everything I've worked for." Dorothy's intake of breath was audible. "It's lovely," she said, and for the first time, her smile seemed genuine. "Truly lovely." They continued down the hill, and Ethan pointed out features of his property. The creek that never ran dry even in the hottest summer, the grove where he planned to build a smokehouse, the field where they would plant wheat come spring. By the time they reached the house, some of Dorothy's tension seemed to have eased. Ethan helped her down from the wagon, then carried her valise inside. "I thought we might have a simple supper tonight," he said, suddenly self-conscious about the modest accommodations. "Give you time to rest after your journey. The preacher can come by tomorrow or the next day, whenever you're ready." Dorothy stood in the center of the sitting room, taking in the hand-built furniture, the stone fireplace, the small bookshelf containing Ethan's modest library. Her fingers trailed over the spines of his books, mostly practical volumes on animal husbandry and agriculture, but also a few treasured novels. "You have Jane Eyre," she noted with surprise. "It was my mother's favorite," Ethan explained. "She taught me to read from that book." Dorothy turned to face him, her expression serious. "Mr. Norwood." "Ethan, before we discuss any wedding arrangements, there's something I must tell you. Something I couldn't put in a letter." Ethan's stomach tightened. Here it came. Whatever secret had driven this refined woman to seek a husband in the wilds of Wyoming. "Of course. Would you like to sit?" She shook her head. "I think it's better if I stand for this." Taking a deep breath, Dorothy unfastened the top buttons of her traveling jacket and reached inside, withdrawing a folded piece of paper. "I haven't been entirely honest with you." The paper trembled in her hand as she extended it toward Ethan. He took it, unfolded it slowly, and found himself looking at a sketch of an infant, a remarkably detailed drawing of a sleeping baby. "I have a daughter," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her name is Emily. She's 7 months old." Ethan stared at the drawing, then at Dorothy, whose green eyes now shimmered with unshed tears. "Your daughter," he repeated. "Where is she now?" "With my former employer in Cheyenne. I wanted to meet you first, to explain, to see if—" Her voice faltered. "If you still wanted to proceed with our arrangement once you knew the truth." "And the father?" Ethan asked, the question emerging more harshly than he intended. Dorothy's chin lifted slightly. He was a professor at the seminary where I taught. He promised marriage, then revealed he already had a wife when I told him about the baby. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I was dismissed from my position, of course. No respectable school can employ an unwed mother. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to process this revelation. A mail-order bride with a child. An illegitimate child. In the strict moral code of the frontier, such a scandal would follow her. Follow them both, like a shadow. Why didn't you tell me in your letters? He asked. Would you have agreed to marry me if I had? The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Ethan wanted to say yes immediately, but honesty compelled him to consider carefully. He'd imagined a fresh start with a woman untouched by scandal. A simple life built on mutual respect that might grow into something more. This complicated everything. I don't know, he admitted finally. But I wish you'd given me the chance to decide with all the facts before you traveled all this way. Dorothy's shoulders slumped slightly. I understand. I can return to Cheyenne on tomorrow's train and make other arrangements. Ethan looked again at the sketch in his hand. The baby had Dorothy's delicate features, the same small nose, the same shaped eyes. An innocent child who'd done nothing to deserve rejection. No, he said, making his decision. No, I don't want you to leave. At least, not before we've had time to think this through. You're exhausted from your journey, and decisions this important shouldn't be made in haste. Relief washed over Dorothy's face. Thank you. I promise. Emily is a good baby, very quiet and sweet-tempered. And I'm willing to work twice as hard to prove myself useful to you. Ethan shook his head. I didn't build this ranch looking for a servant, Miss James. I wanted a partner. He gestured toward the kitchen. Let me fix us some supper, and we can talk more. There's plenty to consider. As Ethan prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits left by a neighbor, his mind raced with questions. What would people say when they learned Dorothy had a child? How would it affect his standing in the community? And could he truly accept another man's child as his own? Yet watching Dorothy as she moved around his home, straightening a cushion here, examining a piece of furniture there, Ethan saw something he hadn't expected. She fit. Despite her Eastern manners and education, she belonged in this house in a way he couldn't quite explain. Over supper, Dorothy spoke more freely about Emily, how she'd kept her pregnancy secret as long as possible, how she'd given birth with only the help of a sympathetic widow, how she'd struggled to find work afterward. I answered your advertisement because you sounded honest, she confessed. Your letters spoke of building something meaningful, not just seeking a convenient housekeeper or, she blushed, or someone to warm your bed. Ethan felt his own face warm at her frankness. I meant every word I wrote. This land, this house, they're nothing without family to share them with. That's what I've been working toward. And now, knowing what you know, Ethan considered his answer carefully. I think we should retrieve your daughter from Cheyenne. Bring her here while we decide what comes next. Dorothy's eyes widened. You would do that? It seems only fair that I meet her before making any permanent decisions, Ethan said reasonably. And I can't in good conscience leave a baby with strangers any longer than necessary. For the first time, Dorothy smiled fully, a transformation that caught Ethan's breath in his throat. Thank you, she said simply. I've missed her terribly, even for these few days. That night, Ethan gave Dorothy his bedroom and made a pallet for himself in the sitting room. As he lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about his home, he wondered if he was being a fool. Plenty of men would have put Dorothy straight back on the train, reputation be damned. Yet something about her courage in coming west alone, in facing him with the truth despite her fear, resonated with Ethan's own values. Building Whispering Pines had required not just strength, but moral fortitude, the determination to do things right, even when right was the harder path. Morning dawned clear and crisp. Ethan rose early to tend his livestock, returning to find Dorothy had prepared breakfast and tidied the kitchen with an efficiency that suggested she was more practical than her refined appearance indicated. I'll need to go to Cheyenne for your daughter, Ethan said as they ate. It's a 2-day journey there and back. Will you be comfortable staying here alone? Dorothy hesitated. I'd prefer to come with you, if that's possible. I've never been separated from Emily for this long before. Ethan nodded, understanding. We'll leave after breakfast. Pack whatever you need. The journey to Cheyenne passed more easily than Ethan expected. Dorothy proved to be an engaging traveling companion, well-read and observant. She asked intelligent questions about ranching and shared stories of her teaching days. By the time they reached the territorial capital, Ethan found himself increasingly curious about the baby who had changed Dorothy's life so dramatically. Mrs. Fletcher, the widow with whom Emily had been staying, lived in a modest house near the edge of town. When she opened the door to find Dorothy on her step, her weathered face creased with relief. "Thank the Lord. I've been that worried about you, traveling alone to meet a stranger." Her sharp eyes took in Ethan, standing a respectful distance behind Dorothy. "This him, then? The rancher?" "Yes, Mrs. Fletcher. This is Mr. Ethan Norwood." "Ethan, this is Mrs. Fletcher, who has been Emily's guardian angel since before she was born." Ethan removed his hat and nodded politely. "Ma'am, I appreciate you caring for the child." Mrs. Fletcher's scrutiny was intense, but brief. "Humph, at least you look honest enough." She stepped back from the doorway. Come in, come in. The little one's just woken from her nap." Dorothy hurried inside, leaving Ethan to follow more slowly, suddenly apprehensive about meeting the baby who might become his responsibility. In the small sitting room, Dorothy was already cradling a bundle wrapped in a soft blanket, murmuring endearments and pressing kisses to a tiny face. "Emily, my sweet girl, Mother's missed you so much." Ethan approached cautiously. The baby in Dorothy's arms had wispy blonde hair and round cheeks flushed pink from sleep. As if sensing his presence, the child turned her head and fixed him with a solemn gaze from eyes as green as her mother's. "Would you like to hold her?" Dorothy asked unexpectedly. Before Ethan could form an answer, he found himself with an armful of warm, squirming baby. Emily regarded him with serious consideration, then reached out one chubby hand to pat his cheek. "She's friendly," Ethan said, surprised by the rush of tenderness he felt. Mrs. Fletcher snorted. "That one. She screamed bloody murder when the minister tried to hold her last Sunday. She's particular about her company." Emily continued to study Ethan with what seemed like approval, eventually breaking into a gummy smile that transformed her little face. Something shifted in Ethan's chest, a loosening of the knot of reservations he'd been carrying. They stayed the night with Mrs. Fletcher, who provided a hot meal and plenty of opinions about their situation. "If you're not planning to marry her proper, young man, you'd best say so now," she told Ethan bluntly when Dorothy had taken Emily upstairs to bed. "That girl's had enough disappointment." "I'm still considering our arrangement," Ethan replied carefully. "It's a decision that affects more than just us now." Mrs. Fletcher nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Better than rushing in without thinking. But don't take too long deciding. A woman with a baby needs security, and if you can't provide it, she should look elsewhere." The next morning, they prepared for the journey back to Whispering Pines. Mrs. Fletcher produced a trunk containing Emily's clothes and necessities, along with a few items that belonged to Dorothy. "I saved what I could when you left the seminary," she explained. "That snake Harrington wanted everything you owned burned, as if that would erase his sin." Dorothy's face tightened at the name, but she said nothing, focusing instead on securing Emily in a sling that would allow her to be carried comfortably during the journey. The return trip was slower with the baby, requiring frequent stops. Ethan found himself increasingly impressed with Dorothy's calm efficiency in caring for Emily under challenging conditions. Despite the hardships of travel, she never complained, even when the baby fussed or needed changing in inconvenient circumstances. By the time they arrived at Whispering Pines, Ethan had made his decision. He waited until Emily was settled for the night in a makeshift cradle he'd quickly constructed from a dresser drawer, then asked Dorothy to join him on the porch. The evening was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Dorothy wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she sat in one of the two rocking chairs Ethan had built the previous winter. "Your daughter seems to be settling in well," Ethan began. "She adapts quickly," Dorothy replied. "It's a blessing in our circumstances." Ethan took a deep breath. "I'd like to discuss those circumstances, if you're willing." Dorothy turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Of course. I won't pretend I wasn't shocked by your revelation," Ethan said honestly. "It wasn't what I expected when I advertised for a wife." "I understand completely if you wish to terminate our arrangement," Dorothy said quickly. "Mrs. Fletcher would take us in until I could find another position." "That's not what I'm saying." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I've been thinking about what makes a family. My parents taught me it's about loyalty, honesty, and commitment, not just blood. My father wasn't a perfect man, but he never walked away from his responsibilities, and neither will I. Dorothy's breath caught audibly. What are you saying exactly? I'm saying I still want to marry you, Dorothy. I want to give Emily my name and raise her as my daughter. No one need ever know she isn't mine by birth. Tears welled in Dorothy's eyes. But what about your reputation? People will count the months from our wedding day. We'll say we married back east before you came west. Ethan said simply. A letter to the county clerk in Cheyenne with the right date, a small fee, and it becomes official. No one questions paperwork from back east. You would do that? Claim another man's child? Start our marriage with a deception? Ethan considered her question seriously. I would. Not for any deception's sake, but to protect an innocent child from the burden of other people's judgments. Emily deserves a fresh start, same as any of us. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. And us? What of our relationship? I don't expect you to love me immediately, but I respect you. Ethan interrupted gently. I admire your courage and your devotion to your daughter. The rest can grow with time, if we let it. Dorothy's smile was tremulous but genuine. Then yes, Ethan Norwood. I will marry you, for Emily's sake and for the chance at the life you've described in your letters. Ethan reached across the space between them to take her hand. It felt right in his, smaller than his own, but strong and capable. There's a justice of the peace in Laramie who can perform the ceremony tomorrow, if you're willing. After that, we can file the paperwork in Cheyenne showing an earlier date. So soon. No sense waiting if we've decided, Ethan said practically. Besides, I'd like Emily to have my name officially as soon as possible. The simple ceremony took place the following afternoon in the justice's parlor, with only his wife and the Wilsons as witnesses. Dorothy wore her best dress, a deep green that matched her eyes, and carried Emily, who remained blessedly quiet throughout the brief exchange of vows. I now pronounce you man and wife, the justice declared. Mr. Norwood, you may kiss your bride. Ethan hesitated only briefly before leaning down to place a gentle kiss on Dorothy's lips. It was meant to be perfunctory, a formality to seal their contract, but something unexpected passed between them, a current of possibility that left both slightly flushed when they parted. That evening, back at Whispering Pines, now officially their home, Ethan helped Dorothy move her few belongings into the bedroom they would share. The arrangement had been discussed with careful politeness. They would share the bed, but Ethan had promised to respect her boundaries until she felt ready for a true marriage. As they prepared for their first night as husband and wife, Emily already sleeping in her improvised cradle, an awkward tension filled the room. Dorothy, dressed in a modest nightgown, her honey blonde hair loose around her shoulders, looked younger and more vulnerable than Ethan had yet seen her. I want to thank you, she said softly as they stood on opposite sides of the bed, for accepting us both. You don't need to thank me for doing what's right, Ethan replied, suddenly awkward in his nightshirt. I'm getting a family out of this arrangement. That's more than I hoped for. Dorothy smiled, some of the tension easing from her posture. Still, it's more than many men would do. Then perhaps your standards for men have been set too low, Ethan said, only half joking. They settled into bed, carefully maintaining space between them. Despite the strangeness of sharing his bed with a woman he barely knew, Ethan found the sound of Dorothy's steady breathing oddly comforting as he drifted toward sleep. Ethan, Dorothy's whisper came just as he was on the edge of consciousness. I think we could be happy here. The three of us. Ethan smiled into the darkness. I think so too. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm more natural than either had expected. Dorothy proved to be as practical and hardworking as her letters had suggested, quickly adapting to ranch life with determination if not always with immediate skill. Her first attempts at cooking on the wood stove produced meals that were charitably described as interesting, but she improved rapidly, accepting Ethan's gentle guidance without resentment. For his part, Ethan discovered an unexpected joy in coming home to a family each evening. Emily began to light up at the sound of his boots on the porch, crawling toward him with squeals of delight that filled him with a fierce pride he'd never anticipated feeling for another man's child. One evening in late spring, as Ethan sat on the porch whittling a small wooden horse for Emily, Samuel Wilson rode up with news from town. "Mail came for you," he said, handing over several letters, including one from Boston that had everyone curious. Ethan accepted the mail with a nod of thanks. People need to mind their own business. Samuel laughed. "Small towns run on gossip, boy. Speaking of which, there's talk about you and your wife." Ethan's hand stilled on his carving. "What kind of talk?" "Just wondering why a fancy Eastern lady would marry a Wyoming rancher sight unseen. Some saying she must have been desperate." Samuel shrugged. "Nothing malicious, mind you, just curiosity." "Dorothy wanted adventure and open spaces," Ethan said evenly. "Not everyone's suited for city life. And that baby of yours, growing like a weed, isn't she? Looking more like her mama every day." Ethan met his neighbor's gaze steadily. "Emily takes after Dorothy's side of the family." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's what I told folks. Said I remembered you mentioning your Eastern wedding in a letter last year. Funny how I'd forgotten until Dorothy arrived." A moment of understanding passed between the men. "Appreciate your good memory, Sam." After Samuel departed, Ethan examined the letters. Most were business correspondence, but one bore elegant handwriting and a Boston postmark. He brought it inside to Dorothy, who was preparing supper while Emily played with wooden spoons on the kitchen floor. "Letter for you," he said, holding it out. "From Boston." Dorothy wiped her hands on her apron before taking the envelope. Her face paled as she recognized the handwriting. "It's from Catherine Reynolds, a former colleague at the seminary." She opened the letter with trembling fingers, reading quickly, her expression growing more troubled with each line. When she finished, she sank into a kitchen chair. "What is it?" Ethan asked, concern edging his voice. "Professor Harrington, Emily's father, is looking for me," Dorothy said, her voice barely audible. "His wife died of influenza over the winter. Now he's telling people Emily is his daughter and that I kidnapped her." Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Can he prove anything? There's no official record naming him as the father, but he was seen with me often enough that people might believe his claim. Dorothy looked up, fear evident in her eyes. "Catherine writes that he's hired a Pinkerton detective to find us." Ethan took the letter, skimming its contents. "Why would he want Emily now, after rejecting you both?" "Heirs," Dorothy said bitterly. "Without his wife, he needs an heir for his family fortune. A daughter isn't ideal, but better than nothing, I suppose." "He can't have her," Ethan said, the vehemence in his voice surprising them both. "Emily is my daughter now. We have the marriage certificate dated before her birth. Legally, she's mine." Dorothy reached for his hand. "But if he comes here, makes a scene, people will talk." "Your reputation, hang my reputation," Ethan interrupted. "I won't let him take her." That night, as they lay in bed discussing their options, Ethan realized with sudden clarity how completely Dorothy and Emily had become his family. The thought of losing either of them was unbearable. "We could leave," Dorothy suggested. "Go further west, maybe to Oregon or California." Ethan shook his head. "This is our home. I won't be driven away by a man who abandoned his responsibilities." He turned to face Dorothy in the darkness. "Do you trust me to protect you both?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "I do." "Then we stay and face whatever comes." Ethan reached out tentatively, touching Dorothy's cheek. "Together." Dorothy leaned into his touch. "Together," she echoed, and then, in a movement that bridged the careful distance they'd maintained, she moved closer and kissed him. Unlike the brief kiss at their wedding, this one lingered, deepening as Ethan responded with unexpected hunger. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard, a new awareness sparking between them. "I didn't expect that," Ethan admitted, his voice rough. Dorothy's laugh was soft in the darkness. "Neither did I, but I'm glad it happened." That night marked a turning point in their relationship, the beginning of a genuine marriage rather than a practical arrangement. As spring blossomed into summer, so too did their connection grow from mutual respect into something deeper and more passionate. Ethan found himself falling in love with his wife's quiet strength, her determination to master ranch skills, her devotion to Emily, and increasingly, her warmth in their shared bed. Dorothy, in turn, discovered in Ethan the honorable partner she'd hoped for but never truly expected to find. Emily thrived under their care, taking her first wobbly steps across the kitchen floor one memorable afternoon, reaching for Ethan with complete trust. "Papa," she called, The first time she'd attempted either parent's name, and Ethan had scooped her up with tears in his eyes. "She called me Papa," he'd said wonderingly to Dorothy. "Because that's who you are," Dorothy had replied simply. But the shadow of Professor Harrington's search hung over their growing happiness. Throughout the summer, they received occasional letters from Catherine with updates. The Pinkerton detective had traced Dorothy as far as Cheyenne. Harrington was offering a reward for information about her whereabouts. He'd been heard claiming his deranged former student had stolen his child. "We should tell Sheriff Taylor the truth," Ethan suggested after the latest letter arrived. "Before Harrington's detective shows up asking questions. Better the sheriff hears our version first." Dorothy agreed reluctantly, and the next day they rode into Laramie together, Emily secured in a sling across Dorothy's chest. Sheriff Taylor, a gruff but fair-minded man who'd known Ethan since his arrival in Wyoming, listened to their story without interruption. "So the child was born before your wedding, though your papers say otherwise," he summarized when they finished. "Yes," Ethan acknowledged. "We wanted to protect Emily from gossip." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Falsifying documents is a crime, technically speaking, but I've seen worse offenses." He stroked his mustache. "This professor, he admitted the child was his?" "To me, yes," Dorothy said. "But he refused to acknowledge her publicly while his wife was alive." "And he never supported you or the baby financially?" "Never. He told me to take care of the problem, and when I refused, he had me dismissed from my position." Sheriff Taylor's expression hardened. "Doesn't sound like a man with a moral claim to fatherhood, legal rights aside." He tapped his fingers on his desk. "Your marriage certificate and Emily's birth registration are in order. Mr. Norwood is named as the father, and you've been living openly as a family. Possession counts for a lot in these parts. So you'll help us?" Ethan asked, hope rising. "I'll do what the law requires," the sheriff replied cautiously. "But the law generally favors existing family units over disruption, especially when a child is thriving." He fixed them with a stern look. "Just keep living as you have been. Let folks see you as the family you claim to be." They left the sheriff's office feeling marginally reassured, but the knowledge that Harrington's detective was getting closer kept them vigilant. Ethan took to carrying his rifle when working the far pastures, and Dorothy rarely ventured into town without him. Their fears materialized one crisp September afternoon when Dorothy was hanging laundry while Emily played in a pen Ethan had constructed near the clothesline. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up to see two riders, a lean man in a city suit and a broader figure she recognized instantly despite the 3 years that had passed. Robert Harrington sat his horse with the same arrogant posture he'd maintained in the seminary's lecture halls, his once handsome face hardened into austere lines. Beside him, the man Dorothy assumed was the Pinkerton detective looked impassively professional. "There she is, Mr. Clark," Harrington said, his cultured voice carrying clearly across the yard. "My daughter, just as I told you." Dorothy moved swiftly to stand between the men and Emily, her heart pounding. "You're trespassing, Professor Harrington." "Dorothy," he acknowledged with a cold smile. "You've led us on quite a chase. Wyoming territory. Really, I expected better from a woman of your education." "Please leave our property," Dorothy said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "My husband will be back soon." Harrington's eyebrow rose. "Husband?" "Yes, we heard about your convenient marriage to a rancher. Tell me, does he know Emily is my child?" "Emily is his daughter in every way that matters," Dorothy replied, her chin lifting defiantly. "Which is more than you can claim." The detective, Clark, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Ma'am, we're not here to cause trouble. Mr. Harrington has legitimate concerns about his child's welfare." "His concerns come 3 years too late," Dorothy retorted. "He denied Emily was his when I told him I was expecting. He watched me lose my position, my reputation, my home, and did nothing." Harrington dismounted, approaching with measured steps. "People change, Dorothy. Losing Constance made me reconsider many things." His gaze moved to Emily, who was watching the strangers with solemn curiosity. "She looks like my mother. Same eyes." "Don't come any closer," Dorothy warned, wishing desperately for Ethan's return. As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound of galloping hooves announced Ethan's arrival. He rode hard into the yard, leaping from his horse before it fully stopped, his rifle in hand but pointed toward the ground. "What's happening here?" he demanded, moving to stand beside Dorothy. Mr. Norwood, I presume, Harrington said smoothly. I am Professor Robert Harrington of Boston. I believe you're raising my daughter. Ethan's jaw tightened. Emily is my daughter. I have the documents to prove it. Falsified documents, Harrington countered. We both know the truth. The detective cleared his throat. Perhaps we could discuss this civilly, gentlemen. Inside, maybe. Dorothy felt Ethan's hand at the small of her back, a reassuring presence. My wife and I have nothing to hide, he said evenly. But I won't have you upsetting her or our daughter. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here. Harrington's face darkened with anger. That child is my blood, my family legacy. I've come to take her home to Boston where she'll have every advantage: education, culture, social position. What can you offer her? Life as a rancher's daughter in this wilderness. Love, Ethan replied simply. Stability. Two parents who want nothing but her happiness. I can provide for her far better than you, Harrington insisted. The way you provided for her mother when she needed you? Ethan's voice remained calm, but Dorothy felt the tension in him. You abandoned them both. Now you want to claim rights you never earned. The detective stepped forward, clearly trying to defuse the growing hostility. Mr. Norwood, the professor is prepared to be generous. He's offering financial compensation for your inconvenience. He's trying to buy my daughter? Ethan's incredulity was palpable. Emily isn't livestock to be sold. Be reasonable, Harrington snapped. You've been married, what, a few months? The child can't mean that much to you. I'm her blood father. Blood isn't what makes a father, Ethan said, his voice dropping dangerously low. Being there every day, that's what matters. I was there for her first steps, her first words. I rock her when she cries and build her toys with my own hands. Where were you? Dorothy reached down to lift Emily from her pen, holding her close. Robert, please. She's happy here. She's thriving. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Harrington's face as he looked at the child in Dorothy's arms, at Emily's healthy cheeks and bright eyes, at the way she nestled trustingly against her mother. I still have legal rights, he said, but with less conviction. Do you? Sheriff Taylor's voice came from the edge of the yard, where he sat on his horse observing the confrontation. Seems to me those rights might be hard to prove, especially against official documents and a family that's clearly doing well. Harrington whirled to face the newcomer. Who are you? Sheriff Nathan Taylor, Laramie County. He dismounted unhurriedly. Got word a stranger was asking questions about the Norwoods in town. Thought I'd ride out and make sure everything was peaceful-like. The detective stepped forward, showing his credentials. Daniel Clark, Pinkerton National Detective Agency. We're investigating a case of, I know who you are, the sheriff interrupted. Word travels. But I'm wondering if you know all the facts of the matter. He turned to Harrington. Professor, did you ever legally acknowledge this child as yours? Pay any support? Sign any documents? Harrington hesitated. Not officially, but, then legally speaking, she's not your daughter, the sheriff said flatly. Meanwhile, I've got marriage records showing Mr. Norwood as her father, birth registration in Wyoming territory naming him as parent, and a community that knows them as a family. Those documents are fraudulent, Harrington insisted. Prove it, Sheriff Taylor challenged. In the meantime, I suggest you consider what's best for the child. Dragging her through courts, tearing her from the only home she knows. Is that really in her interest, or just yours? Emily, as if sensing she was the subject of discussion, began to fuss. Ethan automatically reached for her, and Dorothy transferred the baby to his arms. The natural ease of the gesture, the way Emily immediately settled against Ethan's chest, spoke volumes. Something in Harrington's expression shifted as he watched them. For a brief moment, his arrogant mask slipped, revealing what might have been regret. I just wanted to do right by her, he said, more quietly. Make up for my mistakes. There are other ways to do that, Dorothy said gently. Ways that don't involve taking her from her home. The detective pulled Harrington aside, speaking low and urgently. After several minutes of intense conversation, they returned to face the Norwoods. My client wishes to propose a compromise, Clark announced formally. He will relinquish any claim to the child on the condition that she be told of her heritage when she's of an appropriate age, and that he be permitted occasional correspondence as a family friend. Dorothy looked at Ethan, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded slightly. We can agree to that, she said. Emily deserves to know her history when she's old enough to understand it. Harrington's shoulders sagged, either in relief or resignation. I'll have papers drawn up. A formal relinquishment of claims. He looked at Emily one last time. Take good care of her. We always have, Ethan replied. After Harrington and the detective departed, Sheriff Taylor lingered only long enough to assure them he would keep an eye on the situation. Don't think he'll cause more trouble, he said. Man knows when he's beaten. That night, after Emily was asleep, Ethan and Dorothy sat on their porch watching the stars emerge. Dorothy leaned against her husband's shoulder, his arm around her waist. You were magnificent today, she said softly. Standing up to him like that. Ethan kissed the top of her head. I meant every word. Emily is my daughter in all the ways that count. Dorothy turned to look at him, her eyes shining in the gathering darkness. I love you, Ethan Norwood. Not just for what you've done for us, but for who you are. I love you too, he replied, the words coming easily now naturally. Both of you. You're the family I always wanted. As autumn painted the landscape in gold and russet, Harrington's promised papers arrived. Formal documentation relinquishing any claim to Emily, with provisions for occasional letters and perhaps distant future visits. The threat that had hung over them for months finally lifted, allowing them to look toward the future with untroubled hearts. Winter brought heavy snows that blanketed Whispering Pines in pristine white. Ethan expanded the house, adding a proper bedroom for Emily and a study where Dorothy could pursue her love of literature and perhaps someday teach their children. For Dorothy was expecting again, a child that would be Ethan's by blood as Emily was his by choice. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire watching Emily play with the wooden animals Ethan had carved, Dorothy rested her head against her husband's shoulder. Are you happy? She asked quietly. With how everything turned out? Ethan looked around the room, at the home they'd built together, at the child who called him Papa with complete trust, at the woman who had brought purpose and love into his life, and smiled. Happier than I ever dreamed possible, he answered truthfully. You came with a secret that turned out to be the greatest gift I could have received. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent against the windows of Whispering Pines Ranch, where a family born of courage, compassion, and choice had found their perfect happiness at last.